The night air was heavy in the Carpathians, the kind of silence that presses against the skin like a veil. Mist curled low around the dark pine forests, and the wind moved with the slow whisper of an ancient hymn. In that silence one could almost hear the memory of screams, faint, distant, yet carried across centuries like a phantom. For this was the land of Vlad, son of the dragon, the prince who built a kingdom of dread and carved his legend into the very marrow of Europe. They called him Vlad the Impaler, and in his forests the dead still seemed to sway. He was born into a world already shaped by violence. The 15th century was an age of sieges and shifting loyalties, of empires that pressed like iron against the fragile soil of Wallachia. His father, Vlad Dracul, had sworn loyalty to the Order of the Dragon, a brotherhood of nobles who pledged to defend Christendom against the Ottoman tide. From this vow, the boy inherited both a name and a destiny. But destiny is a cruel tutor, and Vlad's childhood was etched with shadows. As a boy, he and his brother were taken hostage by the Ottomans, a pawn in the endless chessboard of conquest. In the palaces of Edirne, he studied the language of his captors, their courtly games, their cruelty hidden beneath silken veils. When he returned to his homeland, he carried within him the memory of captivity, the sharp edge of humiliation, and the cold hunger for power. Wallachia was no gentle land. Nobles conspired with foreign crowns, betraying rulers as easily as they bent the knee. Assassins moved in the dark, and loyalty was measured in coins and blood. Vlad ascended to the throne not as a monarch of peace, but as a warrior prince forged by betrayal. To keep power, he believed, one had to instill fear so deep it rooted in the soul. And so he turned death into a spectacle. It was said that when envoys arrived from the Ottoman court, refusing to remove their turbans in his presence, Vlad had their headgear nailed into their skulls with iron spikes. When Saxon merchants defied his laws, entire towns were emptied, their inhabitants lifted on sharpened stakes that rose like skeletal forests against the sky. Travelers through Wallachia would find the roads lined with corpses, bodies suspended on pikes, their faces frozen in silent agony, swaying in the wind like ghastly banners of warning. It was not mere execution, but theatre, an art of fear carved in flesh and displayed beneath the heavens to his enemies. He was a demon, a tyrant, who relished the poetry of suffering. Yet to his people he was also a shield. The Ottoman advance threatened to consume the Balkans, and Vlad's brutality was as much a weapon as any sword. His campaigns against Sultan Mehmed II were marked by cunning as much as cruelty. He once launched a night raid upon the Ottoman camp, his men disguised in enemy garments, sowing chaos until the Sultan himself nearly fell. And when the Ottomans pressed deeper into his land, they found themselves halted by a vision that curdled their blood. A field stretched before them, silent beneath the morning sun. 10, 20, perhaps 30,000 corpses rose upon stakes, impaled in neat rows. The ground turned into a sea of death. Soldiers who marched with hardened resolve faltered, their courage buckling before such orchestrated horror. The Sultan, it is said, gazed upon the forest of spikes and chose to retreat, unwilling to face a man who wielded terror with such precision. In this way, Vlad's cruelty became not madness, but strategy, a fortress built from dread. And yet, the line between necessity and obsession is thin, and in time, even allies recoiled. The nobles who had once bent beneath his authority whispered against him. Neighboring rulers spread tales that darkened into legend. Pamphlets printed in German lands painted him as a monster who feasted on blood, who dined beneath the groans of the dying, who reveled in cruelty as a lover revels in touch. Whether these tales were truths sharpened by rumor or inventions crafted to demonize him, none can say with certainty. But once a name becomes a shadow, it cannot be called back into light. He died as violently as he had lived. Accounts differ. Some say he was betrayed by his own men in battle, others that he was struck down in ambush, his body decapitated, his head sent as a grim trophy to Constantinople. Whatever the truth, his end was as shrouded in blood as his life had been. Yet his story did not end with his death. His name travelled far, seeping into folk tales, ballads, and whispered stories around hearthfires. Centuries later, it would rise again, reshaped into the myth of Dracula, the immortal vampire, a lord of night who drank the essence of life. But beyond the myths, the truth of Vlad the Impaler lingers like smoke. Was he a tyrant, lost in the poetry of cruelty? Or was he a ruler who understood that in a land torn between empires, fear was the only fortress that could endure? History offers no single answer. It leaves only the echo of screams across the valleys, the image of corpses swaying in the wind, and the uneasy realization that monsters are not born of fantasy, but of flesh, fear, and the hunger for survival. And so the forests of Transylvania keep their silence. But in the stillness, if one listens long enough, the air seems to shift, as though the earth remembers. The stakes may have rotted, the bones turned to dust, yet the shadow of Vlad remains. It lingers in the hush of midnight, in the mist that coils around ruined castles, in the ancient stones that remember the weight of blood. His tale is not merely one of cruelty, but of the darkness that lies within power itself, the truth that rulers, when pressed by fear, may choose to rule not by love, but by terror. The night remembers him not as a hero, but as a shadow that walked in noble robes. Gilles de Rais, a name once spoken with reverence beside that of Joan of Arc, fell into legend like a star that burned too bright and then collapsed into darkness. He began as a warrior draped in banners, a knight who stood in defense of France when her soil trembled beneath foreign boots. But the centuries whisper a different story of his end. A story woven with blood, silence, and children's cries swallowed by stone walls. In the beginning, he was not the monster that history recalls. Born into the vast wealth of Brittany, grew among castles and forests, where the air smelled of salt from the nearby sea, and the cold mists clung to ruined abbeys. He inherited titles, lands, and an ambition that burned within him like a torch carried through darkened halls. At court, his presence dazzled. He wore silks stitched with gold, feasted with kings, and spent coin like water spilling across stone floors. And in war, he was fearless. Beside Joan of Arc, the maiden who claimed divine visions, he fought to lift the siege of Orleans. He carried the banner of France through smoke and flame, and in those years his name was uttered with pride, for he seemed chosen, touched by destiny itself. But glory fades quickly, like candlelight guttering in a draught. Joan was captured, betrayed, and burned in the marketplace of Rouen. Gilles lived on, knighted, wealthy, celebrated yet haunted. Some said the loss of the maiden who had lit the path of France broke something deep within him. Others whispered that wealth to great and unchecked power corrodes the soul like rust upon iron. What remains clear is this: the hero of Orleans withdrew into his castles, and the world outside began to whisper of things that could not be spoken. Aloud, his fortress at Mackeckel, his halls at Tiffages, were places of beauty by day. Stained glass caught the sun, tapestries fluttered with colour, feasts filled the air with roasted meats and music. Yet at night, the glow of torches painted the stone with red. Children vanished from villages, their laughter silenced, as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Some were said to be led by servants with promises of work or alms, their small hands trusting, their eyes wide with innocence. They passed beneath the heavy doors, and the doors closed. What happened then lingers in fragments, torn from confessions that twist between truth and invention. But even fragments are enough to chill the blood. It is said that guile cloaked his deeds in ritual, mingling cruelty with the trappings of dark ceremony. Servants spoke of chambers where candlelight flickered upon strange symbols, of victims dressed as though for sacrifice, of cries that rose and fell into silence too soon. Some claimed he believed such acts could summon hidden powers or preserve his fading fortune, as though evil itself might be bargained with like a king. Others saw only madness, a nobleman whose mind unravelled under the weight of memory, grief, and unchecked indulgence. And yet the walls of his castles were thick, his servants bound by fear. For years the whispers remained whispers. The nobility looked away, unwilling to accuse one of their own. The poor had no voice strong enough to be heard. It was only when disputes over land and fortune drew Gilles into conflict with church, and crowned that the veil of silence finally tore. The trial that followed was no ordinary proceeding. Priests and judges sat in candlelit halls, their faces pale as parchment, as accusations poured forth. One by one, witnesses spoke of missing children, of bones unearthed, of unspeakable acts whispered in confession. Servants, once loyal, recounted. Nights when they carried small bodies from the chamber, when laughter turned to screams and screams to silence. The words were so dark, so unbearable, that even the chroniclers hesitated to record them, as if ink itself recoiled from truth. Gilles denied, then confessed, then denied again, as though torn between the armour of pride and the crushing weight of his deeds. He spoke of repentance, of demons that had tempted him, of weakness that consumed him, but his words were drowned in the tide of testimony, and the church pronounced its judgment. They led him to the scaffold in Nantes, where the river flowed slow and silent beneath grey autumn skies. Crowds gathered, for even in disgrace he was a figure of fascination, a fallen star whose descent none could look away from. He dressed not in silks but in penitence, his face solemn, his voice broken. Some accounts say he wept, begged forgiveness, and embraced the cross with trembling hands. Others say he met his death with strange serenity, as though at last relieved to lay down the burden of his darkness. The flames rose, smoke curled into the heavens, and the man who had once fought beside a saint was consumed in fire. Yet his story did not end in ash. For centuries, the memory of Gilles de Rais has hovered between history and legend, between horror and ambiguity. Was he truly guilty of every deed laid upon him, or was he partly a victim of envy, of politics, eager to seize his wealth and lands? Did grief and madness truly twist a knight into a predator, or have the shadows of rumor exaggerated his fall until he became more myth than man? The truth is buried, like the bones of those children, beneath the weight of silence and centuries. What remains is the haunting contrast, that a man once hailed as a savior of France, a companion to Joan of Arc, could descend into such abyss, that a knight who rode in shining armor, banners billowing in sunlight, could become remembered not for valor, but for cruelty whispered in trembling voices. He is a figure that reminds us of the fragility of glory, the ease with which light collapses into shadow when unchecked power feeds upon itself. And so, when night deepens and silence fills the air, the tale of Gilles de Rais returns like a faint echo. In his castles, now ruins of stone and moss, some claim the walls still hold the cries of children, carried by the wind through broken towers. The tapestries are gone, the feasts ended, the banners torn, but the silence remains heavy, as though memory itself has not left. There is no comfort in this tale, only reflection, that heroes can fall, that shadows can grow even in the brightest halls, and that the line between legend and nightmare is thinner than a breath. Gilles de Rais remains not merely a man, but a question carved into time itself. How does a hero turn into a nightmare? And perhaps more chilling, could it happen again in another age, beneath another name, when power meets despair? In the dead hush of a Russian winter night, when the stars burned faint and cold above the dark forests, Moscow seemed less a city than a labyrinth of shadows. The wind carried whispers through the wooden alleys, as though the earth itself recoiled from the man who ruled it. In those nights, men said, one could feel his presence even without seeing him. A pressure in the air, heavy, suffocating. A fire that burned not in hearths, but in a pair of eyes that had long since ceased to look upon the world with mercy. Ivan Vasilovich remembered to eternity as Ivan the Terrible was the first to claim the title of Tsar of all the Russias. In him, Russia's old princes were no more, replaced by something far larger, far more dangerous. As a boy he had been scarred by neglect, tossed in the treacherous waters of court intrigues, where poisoned cups and daggers lurked behind every drapery. From that lonely soil, suspicion grew into the root of his being. Even his coronation at 16, when golden crowns glittered above his brow and church bells roared like thunder, could not wash away the memory of those childhood shadows. The people had hoped for a savior. For a time, Ivan seemed destined to be just that. He dreamed of a Russia united, stronger than any fragment of the steppe or foreign kingdom. He commissioned churches, invited scholars, and for fleeting years, The Muscovite state bloomed with the energy of a young ruler who spoke of reform and faith. Yet vision, like fire, burns both light and ruin. As the decades turned, the flame in Ivan's eyes grew crueler. He formed a brotherhood of terror, the Opreknina, dressed in black cloaks, riding black steeds, their saddles marked with dogs' heads and brooms, symbols of sniffing out treachery and sweeping it away. They galloped through the frozen streets of Russia like omens of death. Entire towns felt their hoofbeats before the dawn came. In Novgorod, where whispers of disloyalty stirred, Ivan's fury descended like a storm. The Volkhov River became a grave, its waters choked with bodies, its ice red with spilled blood. Mothers clutched infants as men were dragged from their homes, and the bells of the city tolled not for worship but for mourning. The Kremlin itself became a place of dread. Behind those walls of red stone, beneath vaulted ceilings where candlelight flickered against painted saints, Ivan walked like a spectre of contradictions, fierce in prayer, merciless in command. He would kneel in silence before icons, tears on his face, then rise with orders that condemned thousands. To his mind, Russia was a body infected, and only ruthless fire could purge it clean. Yet with every purge, the body weakened, and paranoia fed upon the ashes. His rage was a living thing, unpredictable, striking without warning. Courtiers spoke softly, as though every word might spark lightning. His closest advisers trembled beneath his gaze. His subjects began to see him less as a man than a force divine, perhaps, or demonic. They called him Grozny, the terrible, not only for cruelty, but for awe, for dread. And then came the day when his wrath turned upon blood of his blood. His son, Ivan Ivanovich, once heir to the throne, became the target of his father's storm. Accounts differ. Some say it was a dispute over military campaigns. Others that it began with a quarrel between the Tsar and his daughter-in-law. But all agree on the moment when rage burst forth. Ivan, eyes blazing with that old fire, struck his son with his staff. The blow fell with the finality of fate. When his fury broke and clarity returned, the Tsar found his heir bleeding, cradled in his arms. Witnesses remembered the chamber as if frozen in time, the great Tsar, terrible to nations, weeping like a broken man, begging his dying son for forgiveness. His cries echoed through the Kremlin's stone halls, a lament too late. With that act, the dynasty's strength fractured. Russia itself seemed to stagger under the curse of patricide, as though the land absorbed the guilt into its soil. After that, Ivan's fire burned colder, more erratic. He remained a ruler, commanding armies, shaping laws, yet his shadow grew longer than his achievements. He was both builder and destroyer, reformer and tyrant. The Russian soul itself seemed to split under his reign, drawn toward the dream of empire, yet scarred by fear and blood. Even in death, he gave no peace. Some say his body lay uneasy, his coffin shuddering during the funeral as if the spirit within resisted burial. Others whisper that the skull, when later examined, bore traces of poison, that perhaps even he, the Tsar of fire, had been devoured by the very treacheries he had spent his life unleashing upon others. The people who once cowered beneath the gallop of black horses carried his memory not as a man, but as a storm that had passed over Russia, leaving ruins and monuments alike. The cathedrals he razed still stood in solemn beauty, their domes like flames frozen in the sky. But the echoes of his terror lingered, a silence that filled every corner of the land he once ruled. What was he? A visionary who dreamed of empire, or a madman consumed by his own demons? Perhaps both. Perhaps it is in that very contradiction that the truth lies. For Ivan was not merely a ruler of men, he was a mirror of Russia itself. Vast, powerful, torn between light and darkness, prayer and cruelty, vision and ruin. Tonight, if you walk the ancient streets of Moscow, you may feel him still, in the Kremlin's red walls, in the bells that toll against the frozen sky, in the silence that falls heavy after snow. The fire in his eyes may be gone, but the smoke of it drifts across centuries. A warning, a legend, a curse. And as the wind moves through the spires of St. Basil's, curling around its painted domes like ghostly breath, one cannot help but wonder, was it Russia that created Ivan, or Ivan who carved Russia into what it would become? The answer lingers like a prayer half-spoken. Lost in the candlelit dark, the wind moves differently around the ruins of Csejte Castle. It does not whistle, so much as it mourns, as though centuries of whispers and cries have been woven into the currents of air that pass through broken stone and empty halls. At night, when the mist curls upward from the Carpathian foothills and the moon hides behind torn clouds, the fortress becomes less a ruin than a memory and echo of velvet gowns sweeping over cold floors, of iron bolts slamming shut, of a silence that feels alive, listening. It is here, in this hollowed carcass of a castle, that the legend of Elizabeth Báthory endures. She is remembered not as a daughter, not as a noblewoman, but as something far darker. The Blood Countess, a name whispered, with both fear and fascination, as if speaking it too loudly might call her shadow to the room. Her story begins not in blood, but in privilege. Born into one of the most powerful families of Hungary in 1560, Elizabeth's lineage was steeped in wealth, influence, and a heritage both proud and cursed. She grew among cold stone corridors and wide courtyards where banners of red and black rippled above her. To the world, she was a woman destined for stature, educated in languages and the refinements of nobility, trained to command servants with a glance and to hold her head high, in courts gilded with gold. Yet beneath the silks and jewels, there was said to be a storm of temper that burned cold, a will that never bent. Those who served her learned quickly. The Countess's smile was rare, and her silence was more dangerous than her voice. The castle where she lived, Csejte, was as severe as the woman who ruled it. Its towers rose out of the Slovak hills like black teeth gnawing at the horizon. Villagers below would speak of its gates with unease, for while every fortress keeps secrets, this one seemed to hunger for them. They said torches burned too long at night, their shadows moved in the upper windows when no one was meant to be awake, that the air around its walls carried not the smell of hearth smoke but of iron-like rust or blood. And so the rumours began. At first, they whispered of cruelty that was unremarkable for her station. Servants punished, girls slapped into obedience, a household kept in fear by its mistress's sharp tongue and sharper temper. But the whispers grew. The girls who entered Csejte castle to serve were not always seen again. Some disappeared without explanation. Others were carried out lifeless, their bodies hidden away in shallow graves, their names never recorded. When families begged for answers, they were silenced with threats or with coin. The castle walls, tall and unyielding, became a prison for those within and a mystery for those without. It was not only death that shadowed her reputation, but the nature of it. Stories told of a woman who found in blood a kind of sanctuary, a dark mirror of beauty. They said that one day, when a maid brushed Elizabeth's hair too roughly, the Countess struck her so hard that blood spilled upon her hand, where the red had touched her skin. Elizabeth thought she saw youth renewed, a softness in her flesh that time had begun to steal. From that moment, she was said to have hunted not only obedience, but life itself, draining the bodies of maidens, bathing in crimson baths that steamed like sacrificial altars, smearing it across her skin as though it were perfume. How much of this was truth, and how much was invention, remained shrouded in the fog of time. But the testimonies given at her eventual trial, hundreds of them, from peasants and nobles, alike painted a portrait of horror. Witnesses spoke of young girls lured to the castle with promises of work, then chained in cellars where screams were muffled by stone. They told of whips and knives, of freezing waters, of flesh torn and life extinguished. The scale of it was staggering. Some claimed a handful of victims, others hundreds, perhaps 600 or more, their youth swallowed by the Countess's hunger. Outside the castle walls, fear thickened into legend. Villagers prayed at night, not for safety, but for invisibility, that their daughters would not be chosen to vanish into those gates. Priests spoke of evil nesting within noble bloodlines, of Satan walking in silk. And yet, the more the story spread, the more it blurred. Was Elizabeth Báthory truly a monster of her own making? Or was she the victim of darker games, the conspiracies of men who sought her lands, her wealth, her downfall? For a powerful woman was a dangerous woman, and enemies are easily fed by rumor. Still, there was something undeniable in the silence that haunted Csejte Castle, something in the records of bodies hidden, in the testimonies of servants who had trembled as they spoke, in the faint but persistent memory of horror that even the passage of centuries could not cleanse. Whether Elizabeth bathed in blood, or whether blood was the ink with which her enemies wrote her ruin, the stain remains the same, a mark that cannot be washed away. In 1610, the walls of her power began to crack. King Matthias II himself pressed for an investigation, though he owed her family much in debt. Soldiers entered the castle and found what the whispers had long foretold. They claimed they discovered mutilated bodies, still warm, scattered in chambers where the Countess's hand was evident. She was arrested, though her noble rank spared her the spectacle of execution. Her accomplices were not so fortunate. Some had their fingers torn out with iron, others were burned alive, the air filled with the reek of scorched flesh. Elizabeth herself was sealed within her castle, bricked into a chamber where only a small slot allowed food to pass through. There, surrounded by stone and silence, she lived 4 more years until death claimed her, and yet she never confessed. Not once did she admit to the crimes laid at her feet. To her last breath, she insisted she was innocent, a noble woman wronged, a pawn in the hands of greedy men. Was it pride? Was it truth? No one can say. What remains are the shadows of testimony, the trembling voices of villagers, and the ruin of a castle where walls seem still to drink the memory of screams. Even now, when the night is cold and the air thick with fog, travelers say the ruins of Csejte are not empty. They claim a woman's figure drifts through the corridors, pale as moonlight, her eyes unblinking, her hands stained dark as though with ink or wine. Sometimes she is heard, whispering her words too faint to catch. Sometimes she is only felt, a chill against the skin, a heaviness in the breath. The Blood Countess, they call her still, though the truth of her remains locked away where history and myth intertwine. And so her story lingers, half shadow, half flame. Was she the embodiment of excess and cruelty, a woman who found her reflection in the surface of blood, or was she a casualty of fear, of envy, of a world that could not bear the power of a woman alone? The answers are buried with her, sealed behind stone and time. All that remains is the legend, the silence of a castle that remembers too much, and the haunting question that will not fade when power and corruption entwine. What part of the story is truth, and what part is the mask we place upon the face of fear? In the hushed silence of midnight, the ruins of Rome speak. The marble columns lie fractured like broken teeth, shadows stretching long beneath the moonlight, as if the earth itself still remembers the screams that once rose from its streets. In that silence, a name drifts like ash on the wind: Nero. Emperor, artist, tyrant, the man who, some say, set his own empire aflame and sang to its ruin. His story is not one of simple history, but of myth and warning, a tale wrapped in smoke and sorrow. The Rome of his youth was a city, already trembling beneath the weight of its own greatness. Endless parades of marble, the roar of gladiators. In the Colosseum, the golden halls of palaces stretching higher with each emperor who longed to leave his mark. Nero ascended the throne at 16, a boy king guided at first by tutors and the iron will of his mother, Agrippina. She had clawed her way through blood and intrigue to see him crowned, and her presence at his side was both blessing and curse. In Nero's earliest days, the people whispered of promise a young ruler with a poet's soul, gentle in manner, different from the brutish Caesars before him. He dreamed not of conquest, but of music, theatre, and eternal applause. Yet beauty, when twisted, often breeds ruin, for power in Rome was never soft, never gentle. The throne was a seat of knives, and in that shadowed court tenderness was a weakness. Agrippina, who had lifted her son to the purple, soon found herself resented by the emperor she made. The young Nero could not endure her suffocating grasp, nor her claim to share in his glory. And so the first great betrayal stained his reign. One night, as dawn's first light touched the Tiber, Nero arranged her death. His mother's body, once cradled in ambition and sacrifice, was struck down at his command. Rome gasped, but none dared oppose him. The boy king had killed his mother, and with her blood his innocence vanished. The years that followed became a theatre of contradictions. Nero wore the robes of Caesar, but within his heart he longed to be remembered not as emperor, but as artist. He performed before crowds, strummed the lyre, recited poetry with trembling fervor. Senators shifted uneasily as their ruler bowed for applause like a common actor. To some it was a charming madness, to others blasphemy, for an emperor was meant to rule armies, not stages. Yet Nero craved an audience, a sea of faces to witness his genius. Even as famine gnawed at Rome's streets, and soldiers muttered in the provinces. Then came the fire. It was high summer in the year 64, the air dry as parchment, the city's alleys narrow and tangled like veins. A single spark no one knew whence set the tinderbox alive. Flames leaped into the night, and soon the eternal city was a furnace. Wooden beams cracked and tumbled, temples smouldered, shrieks split the darkness. As families fled, for 9 days, fire consumed Rome, devouring homes, libraries, shrines, leaving behind only blackened stone and drifting embers. And in that apocalyptic glow, the legend was born. Nero, it is said, stood upon a height, cloaked in imperial robes, plucking his lyre as the inferno raged, singing verses of Troy's burning. To the suffering masses, it seemed the emperor rejoiced in their agony, though some claim he was far from Rome when the blaze began, the image of Nero serenading while the city burned proved too powerful to die. Truth became inseparable from rumor, and history itself was branded with the tale. When the fire at last smoldered into ruin, suspicion turned upon him. The people, scorched and homeless, demanded to know who had kindled the devastation. Some whispered that Nero himself had ordered it, seeking to clear space for his golden palace, a marvel of excess that would rise where ashes still smoked. Its gilded halls stretched vast as a city, its ceilings painted with constellations that shifted as though the emperor commanded the heavens themselves. To those who wandered homeless in the streets, such splendor was not majesty but mockery. Answer was cruel. To divert blame, he pointed to a small, despised sect within Rome, followers of a new faith. Christians who gathered in shadows, speaking of one God. He condemned them to the fire they had not kindled. By torchlight they were crucified, fed to beasts, or set ablaze to light his gardens. Rome watched in horror, but few raised voices. The empire was ruled by fear, and fear silences truth. The years dragged on, and the emperor, who once sang for love of art, now sang to drown the sound of his collapsing realm. He killed rivals, exiled friends, silenced senators. His second wife, Poppyja, is said to have perished at his hand in a fit of rage, though even that tale swims in rumor. His performances grew more elaborate, his need for adoration insatiable. Yet the applause waned, replaced by murmurs of rebellion. Armies in the provinces rose against him. The Senate, once his stage, now whispered of his removal. And so came the final act of Nero's tragedy, abandoned by his guards, condemned by the Senate. He fled the palace that had once gleamed like the sun. In a lonely villa, surrounded only by a handful of trembling attendants, the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors faced his end. The man who dreamed of immortality through music found no courage in silence. "What an artist dies in me," he is said to have whispered as he pressed a blade to his throat, too fearful even to strike the blow himself. With his death, Rome's first imperial dynasty crumbled, leaving behind only smoke and memory. Yet Nero never truly vanished. His name endured in the whispers of ruined marble, in the blackened stones of Rome that bore the scars of fire. To some, he was madness incarnate, a tyrant who sang while the world burned. To others, he was a tragic soul, crushed by the weight of divinity he could never bear. The truth lies somewhere between ash and song, between the echo of his lyre and the cries of a city in flames. And even now, in the stillness of night, when wind stirs through the ruins of the Palatine Hill, it is said one might hear faint music, drifting through the stones, the ghost of an emperor still yearning for applause, still playing his eternal song as Rome burns forever in memory. For some fires are never extinguished. They smolder within legend, glowing faintly, waiting to be remembered. The night air in Cambodia carries a stillness that feels almost unnatural, as though the land itself is holding its breath. The rice fields stretch endlessly, glistening beneath the moon, but beneath their calm surface lies something far more harrowing than soil and root. The earth hides bones, millions of them stacked in silence. Layer upon layer of lives once lived, now reduced to fragments of memory and dust. It is here that the shadow of Pol Pot lingers, not in monuments or statues, but in the haunting emptiness of the land. His dream of purity turned Cambodia into a graveyard, and every whisper of wind through the grass feels like the murmur of the dead. Before the blood, there was the vision. Saleth Sar, who would come to be known as Pol Pot, was not born beneath storm clouds. His childhood was gentle, his family modest. He studied in Paris, absorbing ideas that spoke of revolution and new beginnings. Like a moth drawn to flame, he was enchanted by utopian promises, visions of societies made pure through the cleansing fire of radical change. He dreamed of a Cambodia reborn, a land without corruption, greed, or inequality. Yet every utopia is forged with shadows, and Pol Pot's dream would demand sacrifices greater than anyone could imagine. When the Khmer Rouge rose to power in 1975, it was as if time itself was ripped from Cambodia's hands. Within days, the bustling capital of Phnom Penh was emptied. Families were forced from their homes, hospitals evacuated, markets abandoned. The city became a hollow carcass, its streets echoing with nothing but the footsteps of soldiers. Millions were driven into the countryside with promises of equality, simplicity, and communal life. Yet what awaited them was not purity, but starvation, labor, and death. The regime saw knowledge as poison, books as weapons, and the educated as enemies. Teachers, doctors, monks, musicians, any who bore the mark of learning or culture were condemned. Glasses became a death sentence, for they suggested literacy. Even laughter was dangerous, for joy was a spark of individuality in a world where individuality itself was forbidden. The Khmer Rouge demanded silence, and silence is what they created. One body at a time. The fields became the stage of this silence. Villages were transformed into labor camps, where families worked under the burning sun until their bodies broke. Hunger hollowed the people, their stomachs twisting into knots of pain, their eyes growing glassy with despair. In the darkness of night, men and women were taken away, never to return. The sounds that haunted the villages were not of birds or insects, but of the muffled cries from the trees where lives were extinguished in secrecy. The killing fields, such a simple phrase for such unthinkable horror. Here, the earth was forced to swallow what human hands had destroyed. Children were torn from their mothers, husbands from their wives. Tools of farming became tools of execution. Blood seeped into the soil until the land itself seemed to drink. Sorrow, even now, fragments of bone and scraps of cloth rise from the dirt after heavy rains, as though the past refuses to remain buried, and through it all, Pol Pot remained convinced of his vision. He believed that by stripping away the old world, the cities, the schools, the families, he could create a new Cambodia, one purified through suffering. He called it Year Zero, as if all history, all memory, all humanity could be erased with a single stroke. But the more he erased, the more he destroyed, until nothing remained but emptiness. Those who survived speak of silence as their most vivid memory. Silence at the dinner tables, where there was no food. Silence in the temples, where monks had vanished. Silence in the nights, broken only by the soft rustle of soldiers leading away their victims. Cambodia became a country of whispers, where every word could mean betrayal, and every glance could mark the end. The sorrow was not confined to the fields alone. It seeped into the rivers, the forests, the very sky. Children grew up without laughter. Mothers carried grief as their only possession. Fathers walked with bowed heads, knowing their strength could not protect their families. And yet, even in the midst of such despair, there were flickers of humanity. A secret piece of rice saved for a starving child, a whispered prayer beneath the moon, a mother's lullaby sung softly in the dark, even as she knew she might not see the dawn. As the years stretched on, the land became saturated with loss. Nearly 2 million lives were erased: teachers, farmers, lovers, children, each one a thread in the fabric of Cambodia's soul, torn away forever. The Khmer Rouge had not built a utopia, but a kingdom of ghosts. When the regime finally collapsed in 1979, it was not through repentance, but through the force of invasion. Pol Pot fled into the jungles, carrying his vision like a dying ember, still insisting that he had been right. But his words could not drown out the silence he had created. He lived out his days in obscurity, far from the fields he had filled, with bones, and when he died in 1998, there were no monuments to his name, no crowds to mourn him, only the lingering shadow of his dream turned nightmare, and yet the land remembers. Walk through the fields today, and you will feel it, the heaviness in the air, the sorrow in the soil. The grass may sway, the birds may sing, but beneath it all is a silence too deep to ignore. Skulls and bones still rise from the ground, silent witnesses to what was done. In the memorials, glass towers hold the remains of thousands, their empty sockets staring outward as though asking a question that cannot be answered. How could this happen? The story of Pol Pot is not just the story of a man, but of the danger that lies within dreams of perfection. For in his pursuit of purity, he destroyed the very essence of humanity. He wanted to build a world of equality, yet he left behind only ruins and sorrow. The fields of bones are his legacy, a reminder that any dream which denies the value of life is nothing more than a path to destruction. In the hush of night, when the winds drift over Cambodia, it is said you can still feel the weight of those who were lost, not in words, not in screams, but in silence, the deepest silence, heavy and eternal, the silence of millions who once lived, who once loved, who once laughed beneath the same sky. A silence that asks us to remember, and to never allow such shadows to rise again. For beneath the green fields of Cambodia lies a truth that cannot be hidden, that the earth itself has become a grave, and that every blade of grass whispers the same refrain: the past is never truly buried. It waits just beneath the surface, in the fields of bones. The wind howls across the empty steppes, as though carrying the voices of the dead. Beneath a sky without mercy, the grass bends like armies bowing before an unseen master. In this silence, the name still whispers: Attila, the scourge of God, the shadow that fell upon Europe like a storm without end. His footsteps were said to blacken the earth. His eyes, it was told, gleamed with the fire of wolves, and his coming, like thunder rolling over plains, heralded the ruin of cities and the trembling of kings. They said the world itself recoiled from his presence. The Romans, who had once claimed eternity for themselves, now cowered behind trembling walls, waiting for the sound of hooves. Bishops prayed, emperors offered tribute, and mothers whispered to their children that silence might save them. Yet, in the hearts of the Huns, he was not a monster, but a father of destiny, the chosen of the sky, whose bow was like the lightning of heaven, and whose hand carved the will of fate across nations. The year was the 5th century, and Europe lay wounded. The empire that had once ruled the world staggered beneath the weight of its own ruin. Cities that had flourished now rotted in decay. The barbarians at its borders were no longer shadows in the forest, but lords of its fields. Into this twilight rode Attila, a figure both feared and revered, bearing upon his brow not the crown of Rome, but the wild freedom of the steppe. His armies were swift as falcons, striking without warning, vanishing without trace. Cities fell like autumn leaves before the wind. Aquileia, once proud and radiant, was consumed by fire until even its ashes seemed to vanish from the earth. Across the Danube, smoke followed his trail, and the rivers ran thick with grief. Rome itself, the eternal city, quaked in dread. The Emperor Valentinian sent gold, a ransom to buy breath, as though coins could bribe the storm. But to Attila's people, these were not acts of terror, they were signs of greatness. He was the hand of heaven's justice, punishing a world grown soft and corrupt. The Huns, children of the endless steppe, followed him not in fear, but in fierce devotion. They told one another that when Attila rode, the sky itself bent low to hear his command. And yet, even amidst the thunder of conquest, there was in him a silence, a shadow that clung to his figure like frost at dawn. Some said Attila had been granted the sword of Mars, unearthed by a shepherd who stumbled upon it in the field. To his followers, it was proof that he had been chosen by the gods to rule all lands under the sky. The sword flashed in battle, and enemies broke like brittle glass. To Rome, it was a nightmare made flesh. To the Huns, it was the seal of heaven's will. Yet what makes a man both savior and destroyer? Was Attila merely a wolf unleashed upon a trembling world? Or was he the mirror of its own decay, the embodiment of divine retribution? When he approached the gates of Rome itself in the year 452, famine and plague already stalked the streets. The eternal city stood on its knees, waiting for the final blow. But then came a vision no one could explain. Pope Leo, unarmed and clad in the white of humility, rode out to meet him. What words were spoken, no record has preserved. Some said Attila saw beside Leo the ghostly figures of saints, warning him of divine wrath should he dare to enter Rome. Others believed the gold was offered in secret, a treasure heavy enough to stay even his hand. Whatever truth lingered in the meeting, the outcome was this: the wolf turned away, and Rome, for a time, still breathed. Yet storms do not linger forever, even when they seem eternal. Only 3 years later, the scourge of God fell not by blade, nor arrow, but by something far stranger. On the night of his wedding, after taking a new bride, Attila was found dead. Some whispered it was a nosebleed that choked him as he slept, a death too humble for so vast a terror. Others said his bride, forced into his arms, slew him with her own hand, a silent vengeance against the tyrant. Still others believed poison flowed in the cup he drank. The truth was swallowed by silence, and the scourge of God passed into shadow. His people wept with a grief that shook the steppes. They mourned as though the sun itself had fallen. The Huns prepared a funeral not of earth alone, but of myth. They dressed him in the finest silks, laid him with gold and gems, and buried him in coffins of iron, silver, and gold, one within the other, as though layers of eternity could shield him. The slaves who dug his grave were slain, their blood sealing the secret of his resting place. The river Tisa was said to have been diverted to cover him, so that no man would ever find his bones. Thus, the scourge vanished, leaving no monument, no tombstone, no temple of marble. Only silence, only echoes. His grave, like his life, became a mystery lost in the folds of time. And so he endures, not as a body beneath the soil, but as a whisper upon the steppes, as a shadow in the chronicles of men. When we speak of Attila, we speak not only of one man, but of the storm that rides across history, the reminder that no empire is eternal, no city unbreakable, no ruler. He was both scourge and savior, ruin and glory, terror and devotion. A man who lived like fire and died like smoke. And perhaps that is the final truth, that storms do not die, they only pass, and though their thunder fades, the memory of their power lingers in the silence after the rain. So it is with Attila, the scourge of God, the rider who vanished, yet whose hoofbeats still echo faintly across the plains of time. In the marble silence of Rome, beneath the shadow of temples that caught the first light of dawn, a whisper began to stir. It was the murmur of a name, half prayer and half curse. Caligula, To the masses he was at once a savior, a spectacle, and a storm that darkened the horizon of empire. He rose like a comet blazing across the Roman sky, carrying with him the promise of renewal. Yet, as with all blazing stars, his brilliance contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. The people had waited long for his reign. His predecessor, Tiberius, had ruled with suspicion, retreating into the depths of Capri while his ministers bled the city of joy. Caligula, the young grandson of the beloved Germanicus, entered Rome like a tide washing away years of fear. His first days as emperor were filled with gifts, banquets, and gladiatorial games. He freed prisoners, restored exiles, and opened the gates of Rome to laughter once more. Statues of the gods seemed to gaze upon him approvingly, as though Olympus itself had bent low to bless his name. Rome whispered of a golden dawn, but gold, when left too long in the fire, melts into something molten and dangerous. It began subtly, as whispers always do. Caligula, they said, was ill. Some claimed epilepsy gripped him in the night. Others spoke of madness inherited, shadows clinging to his mind like a curse passed down from ancestors. He would vanish into chambers, then return with eyes to bright, as though they had glimpsed something no mortal should. And from those chambers, decisions were born that bent the very spine of Rome. The emperor's desires grew vast, stretching beyond the mortal realm. He demanded to be worshipped not as a man, but as a god. Temples that once rang with prayers to Jupiter and Apollo were rededicated in his name. He had statues of himself raised among the immortal figures of Olympus. Some he ordered reshaped. The head of Zeus chiseled away, replaced by his own likeness. Citizens bowed before him in ritual, their lips trembling as they offered incense to one who had been born not of heaven, but of flesh. What does power do when it is left unchecked? It devours, like fire consuming the olive groves. Caligula drank deep of that fire, and soon the line between play and cruelty dissolved. He found sport in death, ordering executions for entertainment, delighting as blood spilled beneath the Roman sun. He squandered the treasury with spectacles, not merely to dazzle but to dominate, reminding his people that their lives, their fortunes, even their breaths, belonged to him. And yet, amidst these storms, there was comedy woven into tragedy. For Caligula, in his boundless absurdity, appointed his horse, Incitatus, to high office. The creature was adorned with marble stables, jeweled harnesses, and golden oats. Senators were forced to bow to the beast, as though Rome's dignity could be mocked into obedience. To laugh was dangerous. To remain silent was to drown in humiliation. Thus the empire stood on the edge of ridicule, while its ruler crowned folly with laurel wreaths. The whispers grew heavier, darker. Was this emperor truly mad? Or was his cruelty calculated, a deliberate theatre of terror meant to remind Rome that the divine and the deranged are divided only by belief? His eyes, it was said, gleamed with something unfathomable, as though he were gazing not upon men but upon insects to be crushed. Yet there were moments, too, when he wept in loneliness, when the god he claimed to be could not shield him from the void within his chest. In those hours, Rome shuddered, for the emptiness of a god is a cavern that demands filling, and it is always the people who are poured into it. The climax came not with a shout, but with the sharp silence of knives. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him, conspired against the very man they served. Perhaps they had grown weary of his mockery, or perhaps fear had at last demanded release. On a winter's day, in a shadowed corridor of the Palatine, blades flashed. The emperor, who had declared himself immortal, felt mortal steel enter his body. His blood spilled across the stone, hot and vivid, staining the palace floor where he had once walked like a god. His cries echoed for a moment, then were swallowed by the silence that follows every fall of power. Rome gasped, but Rome did not mourn. The man who had risen as a dawn had set in darkness, leaving behind a city scarred with the memory of excess. The Senate, the guards, the people all breathed easier, as though a great weight had been lifted from the air. Yet in their relief, a question lingered like smoke. Had they slain a madman, or had they slain the reflection of their own empire's hunger, mirrored too perfectly in a single man? For Caligula was not alone in his madness. He was Rome distilled, a mirror of its glory and its grotesque appetite. His reign was a fever dream, yes, but dreams reveal the secret heart of the dreamer, and Rome, ever proud, ever thirsty for spectacle and dominion, had dreamed him into being. As the night deepened and the lamps burned low, the city lay restless, pondering the thin thread that binds the divine to the deranged. Caligula had reached for godhood and drowned in illusion, but the story did not end with him, for power has always beckoned, whispering promises in the ears of those bold enough to seize it. And every empire, sooner or later, must ask itself, when the throne grows too heavy, does it crown a man, or does it awaken a god who is, at heart, no more than a man gone mad? The marble palaces remained, their columns still standing, their shadows stretching across the city at dusk. But the memory of Caligula walked among them like a ghost, a warning etched into the stones. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when even the Tiber slept, one could almost hear his laughter echoing faintly. Neither god nor man, but something that had tried to be both and shattered under the weight of it. The window of Samarkand carries whispers that do not fade. Even in the dead of night, when the city sleeps beneath the glow of stars, the stones themselves seem to breathe the memory of a man whose shadow once stretched across half the earth. Tamerlane, the lord of conquest. His name was a word that opened wounds, a syllable that turned kingdoms to ash, a prayer whispered in fear rather than devotion. To some, he was the avenger of faith, chosen to carve order into chaos. To others, he was nothing less than the living embodiment of ruin, a tempest of blood and fire sent to test the endurance of humankind. He was born on the steppes of Central Asia, where the horizon stretches unbroken and the earth seems endless. Out of this vastness, Timur rose lame in one leg from a hunting wound, yet carrying within him a hunger that no injury could weaken. They said he limped like a wolf, prowling with relentless cunning, never ceasing, never resting. The world first knew his footsteps in silence, then in thunder, as his banners gathered like storm clouds across the plains. When his armies descended, the earth trembled. Cities that had stood for centuries collapsed in days, Delhi, Baghdad, Aleppo all learned to fear the iron will of the conqueror who carried no mercy in his march. It is said that outside Isfahan, after rebellion stirred against him, Timur ordered a tower of skulls to be built, each bone stacked with cold precision. The tower gleamed in the sun, a macabre monument to obedience, and when Baghdad defied him, he left the city cloaked in silence, as if the very air had been stripped from it. Witnesses swore the Tigris ran black with ink from ruined libraries, and red with blood from those who had once called it home. To ride beneath his banner was to ride behind death itself. Yet his men followed with zeal, for Timur carried not only the sword, but the language of destiny. He claimed his wars were guided by faith, that his conquest was the will of heaven. His victories were painted with divine sanction, his cruelty wrapped in the cloth of righteousness. But the earth remembers not his prayers, only his pyramids of bones, still buried beneath layers of dust and silence. And yet, for all his fire, Timur loved beauty. He drew poets, scholars, and architects into his orbit, demanding that art and splendor bloom even in the shadow of war. Samarkand became his jewel, adorned with mosques and gardens, a city of turquoise domes that rose like prayers of stone. But this beauty was not gentle, it was won from blood. Built by captives dragged from distant lands, their skill chained to his vision. To walk through those streets was to feel both awe and unease, for the domes seemed to gleam with the sorrow of the conquered. Timur's reign ended as all reigns must, though his spirit seemed unwilling to surrender. He died in the winter of 1405, as he prepared to march once more, this time against the Ming dynasty of China. Some say the cold pierced even his iron frame. Others whisper it was the weight of his own sins pressing finally upon him. His body was laid to rest in Guriamir, his mausoleum in Samarkand, beneath a slab of black jade carved with words that trembled like prophecy. When I rise from the dead, the world will tremble. For centuries, the conqueror slept beneath that stone, but the earth never forgot, and neither did men. In 1941, Soviet archaeologists pried open Timur's tomb, chasing secrets from the bones of the long-dead emperor. Among the elders of Samarkand, fear rippled like wind over the steppe. They warned of the inscription, of the curse bound within the stone, but warnings fell silent against curiosity and ambition. The sarcophagus was opened, the body of the great conqueror revealed, his skull cracked, his frame still heavy with the aura of a man who had ruled through terror. And then, as if in answer, the world shuddered once more. Only days later, Hitler unleashed his armies against the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa began, and with it, rivers of blood returned to the earth. Cities burned, millions perished, and Europe was again cloaked in a storm of death and ruin. To the faithful of Samarkand, it was no coincidence. Timur had warned the world. His sleep disturbed, his wrath awakened. The shadow of conquest unfurled once again. It is said that when his body was returned to the earth, when the tomb was resealed, with reverence and prayer, the tide of war began to shift. The Soviets pushed back against the invaders, and the iron hand of Timur was quiet once more beneath the jade stone. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps the earth itself obeyed the rhythm of an old conqueror's heart. Even now, pilgrims and wanderers enter the hushed chamber of Guru Emir. They gaze upon the solemn jade, its green veins shimmering in candlelight, and they whisper of the man who sleeps beneath. To stand there is to feel the breath of centuries pressing close, as though Timur's eyes still watch, waiting for the world to forget, waiting for the silence of time to grow too heavy. What is a conqueror, after all? Is he a man, or is he a wound upon the earth that never fully heals? Timur's empire crumbled long ago, his towers of skulls scattered by wind and sand. Yet his story endures, heavy as iron, delicate as breath. In the stillness of night, when the air is thick with memory, one might wonder if some men are too vast to die, if their shadow lingers long after their flesh is gone, and so the wind moves through Samarkand, brushing against turquoise domes, rattling the old stones, whispering his name, Timur, the Lord of Conquest, a man who carved obedience from terror, who cloaked himself in destiny, who built and destroyed with equal ferocity. He lies silent now, yet the question remains, does the earth truly hold him, or does his spirit still ride the endless steppe, searching for another dawn to conquer? In the frozen silence of Russia's winter nights, where the wind howls like a restless spirit and snow lies heavy upon the earth like a shroud, a name still lingers on trembling lips, Rasputin. He rises in memory like a shadow against the flame, both feared and desired, saint and monster. A man whose eyes were said to pierce the soul as though they carried within them the secrets of eternity. His life unfolded not like the tale of a man, but like a myth, woven from whispers of miracles and sins, a parable of power that refused to die even when his body was finally dragged beneath the ice. He was born not in palaces, nor in cities of stone, but in the mud and frost of a Siberian village, a peasant child, barefoot upon frozen soil, son of earth and silence. The land that shaped him was raw and merciless, a place where survival itself was a prayer. In that endless winter, Rasputin learned hunger and hardship, yet also the strange currents of spirit that seemed to run beneath the frozen world. Tales were told that even as a boy his gaze unsettled others, not cruel, but to knowing too deep. Some turned away, muttering that his eyes saw what should remain unseen. Others followed him as though drawn to a hidden light in the dark. He wandered as he grew, a pilgrim across holy Russia, moving from monastery to monastery like a restless bird of prey, never fully belonging, always searching. His robes were ragged, his beard unkempt, his body worn, yet when he prayed, people swore the air itself grew still. He had no title, no wealth, no power, only an aura that clung to him, an intoxicating presence that made peasants bow their heads and noblewomen fall to their knees. They called him Staryotes, holy wanderer, though the priests muttered he was no true monk, that he strayed too far into darkness. It was through suffering that he found his path into the halls of the mighty, in the great palaces of St. Petersburg, where candlelight glowed against marble columns and the air was thick with perfumes of another world. There lived the heir to the Russian throne, young Alexei Romanov, fragile as glass, cursed with a bleeding disease that no physician could cure. His life was a constant gamble with death, each fall, each bruise a step closer to the grave. Into this palace of despair was summoned the peasant wanderer, the unwashed mystic whose reputation was already tangled in scandal and rumor. And yet, when Rasputin prayed over the boy, the bleeding stopped. The child breathed easier, and hope returned to the Empress's haunted eyes. From that moment, his fate entwined with theirs. The Empress Alexandra clung to him like a drowning soul to a lifeline, believing he alone stood between her son and the abyss. To her, he was a holy man sent by God. To others in court, he was a serpent coiled around the throne, whispering poison into royal ears. Ministers and generals watched with growing dread as this ragged wanderer rose higher than any of them, dining with czars, guiding decisions, even daring to rebuke the crowned heads of Europe with the fire of prophecy. He predicted victories, spoke of disasters to come, and every word, whether fulfilled or failed, added to his legend. But the stories that swelled around him were not only of miracles. They whispered of nights heavy with wine and women, of orgiastic rituals and secret indulgences, of a man who claimed holiness even while wallowing in sin. His enemies called him corrupter, madman, devil in Cossack. Yet others swore that he sinned, so that he might bear the sins of others, drowning himself in darkness to bring others light. To some he was Christ-like, to others Antichrist, and always his eyes burned, strange and unyielding, as though they gazed past the veil of this world. Russia itself trembled as war and revolution loomed on the horizon, and many laid the blame at the feet of Rasputin. Ministers who opposed him fell from grace, generals who defied him were dismissed, and the empire, already cracking under the weight of bloodshed, cursed his name. To his enemies, his very breath was poison, his survival a wound upon the nation. They conspired in silence, sharpening daggers, not of steel, but of betrayal. Noblemen, once proud of their honor, plotted like thieves in the night, whispering that Rasputin must die if Russia was to live. And so the stage was set for his final night, a night that reads like myth rather than history. They lured him to a palace with promises of drink and delight, a velvet trap gilded with shadows. They poured him poisoned wine, enough to kill a man thrice over, and yet he drank deeply and laughed, his body refusing the silent death they had planned. They fed him cakes laced with cyanide, and still his voice rang out in coarse song, his eyes shining with fire. Panic grew in the hearts of his assassins. Was he demon? Was he immortal? Desperation drove them to guns, and shots rang out in the night, echoing like thunder over snow. He fell, they thought, but when they approached, he rose again, staggering, bleeding, crawling like a wounded beast toward freedom. Only when bullets shattered his body and icy waters closed over him did silence at last claim him. Yet even then, whispers said his lungs had filled not with poison, not with blood, but with water, that only the river itself had been strong enough to end him. The empire he haunted did not outlast him long. Within months, the Romanovs were dragged into darkness, their dynasty extinguished in a cellar of gunfire. Russia was swallowed by revolution and ruin, and in its flames the figure of Rasputin loomed ever larger, as though his death had not ended. his influence, but scattered it like ash into the winds of legend. To this day, his name does not rest. He is remembered in candlelit stories told with shivers, in songs, in poems, in curses. Was he healer or deceiver, saint or monster, man or myth? The snow keeps its silence, and the river its secrets. What is certain is that Rasputin walked a path no ordinary man could tread. His life was both a wound and a prophecy, a mirror in which Russia saw its own contradictions, faith and corruption, holiness and sin, salvation and ruin. And perhaps that is why his legend endures. For some, he was proof that God still walked among peasants. For others, proof that the devil wears the robe of a monk. Yet in the flickering candlelight of midnight tales, when his name is spoken, one can almost feel those strange eyes upon them, still watching, still waiting, as though death itself could not contain him. Beneath the veil of night, when the wind moves softly across the red soils of Uganda, there lingers a silence heavy as iron. It is a silence that carries the weight of unspoken grief. The echoes of drums, once beaten for joy, now muted by sorrow. In this silence lies the shadow of a man who rose from obscurity to crown himself with terror. His name was Idi Amin, soldier, ruler, showman, butcher. His was a reign where laughter masked cruelty, where banquets were staged atop the graves of the vanished, and where fear itself seemed to walk barefoot through every home. The story begins not in palaces, but in barracks, in the sweat-stained uniforms of colonial soldiers. Born in the rugged north of Uganda, Amin grew tall and broad, his presence impossible to ignore. His body was forged for war, his mind hardened in the service of the King's African Rifles, where the British trained him to obey without question and fight without mercy. He was taught the language of violence before he ever learned the language of power. In him the British saw a weapon, blunt but effective, and in himself he saw only hunger for recognition, for dominion, for a stage vast enough to hold his swelling ego. When Uganda's independence dawned in 1962, Amin stood ready like a vulture circling fresh prey. He was loyal to no ideology, no cause but his own ambition. Behind his broad smile lay sharp instincts, and behind his uniform lay a man who learned that charm could open doors even faster than brutality. He laughed loud, joked easily, and moved with the disarming air of a man who seemed almost childlike. But behind this mask, he was sharpening his knife. By 1971, when the nation slept beneath ordinary stars, Amin struck. Tanks rolled through Kampala, boots thundered on tarmac, and the breath of Uganda was stolen in the night. President Milton Obodo was gone, exiled as the soldier turned predator crowned himself head of state. Crowds filled the streets at first with jubilation, for Amin played the part of liberator. He waved from open cars, smiled with dazzling warmth, and promised freedom, dignity, and a future bright with hope. His laughter was infectious, his presence magnetic. Yet even as his people danced, the first seeds of fear were being sown. One by one, those who opposed him began to vanish. Rivals disappeared like mist swallowed by the morning sun. Their names were spoken in whispers, their fates unmarked but known in every trembling heart. Bodies floated in the Nile, their silence a grim testament to a ruler who tolerated no disobedience. And still Amin smiled. He staged parades, welcomed foreign dignitaries, and cast himself as both warrior and clown. A spectacle for cameras that could not capture the blood soaking into the soil. Just beyond their lens, Amin's Uganda became a theatre of contradictions. He loved to dress in elaborate uniforms heavy with medals, each one self-applauded. He gave himself titles swollen with absurd grandeur: conqueror of the British Empire, lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, and, in a surreal flourish, King of Scotland. In his fantasy, he was a monarch beyond borders, a hero of Africa's dignity. But behind the golden epaulets, there were prisons where screams echoed through concrete walls, where the air itself seemed to weep with despair. It was not only rivals who felt his wrath. Entire communities were cast into exile or slaughtered beneath his decree. In 1972, Amin expelled Uganda's Asian population, tens of thousands of families, torn from the land they had called home for generations. Their shops shuttered, their homes abandoned, their lives uprooted. With a single stroke of his pen, Amin stripped his nation of its economic heart, all under the guise of nationalism. The markets emptied, the fields withered, and the wealth he had promised to his people dissolved into dust. And yet he laughed. His booming voice echoed across state radio, telling stories, mocking enemies, casting himself as invincible. To many in the world, he seemed a caricature unpredictable, even comic in his theatrics. But within Uganda, no one laughed. Fear became the nation's only constant companion. Families hushed their conversations. Eyes darted over shoulders. Trust dissolved for any one neighbor, friend. Even kin might whisper the wrong word, and with it invite the visit of soldiers in the night. The Nile itself seemed to carry the nation's grief, swollen with the bodies of those who once dared to speak. Fishermen told of catching nets heavy with the dead, their faces pale against the dark waters, their silence haunting. Amin's terror was not merely in the killings, but in the uncertainty. No one knew who might vanish next, or why. The randomness itself was his weapon, for it made obedience the only refuge. As the years passed, his paranoia deepened. Once trusted allies were purged. Generals fell beneath his suspicion. Ministers who dined with him one evening were executed. By dawn, even his own family was not spared the cruelty of his storms. He grew restless, pacing the corridors of his palaces, surrounded by guards, yet consumed by fear. His laughter remained, but now it rang hollow, like a drum beaten on the skin of despair. The climax of his madness came with war. In 1978, driven by arrogance and delusion, Amin invaded neighboring Tanzania. He boasted of conquest, imagining his empire stretching wider than the map would allow. But the gamble failed. Tanzanian forces, joined by Ugandan exiles, marched upon his capital. Kampala trembled, not with celebration, but with liberation. The tyrant's mask of invincibility cracked. His medals clinked uselessly in empty halls as he fled into the night, abandoning the nation he had once claimed as his throne. Exile carried him far from Uganda, yet even in Saudi Arabia, where he spent his remaining years, the shadow of his cruelty clung to him. He lived in comfort, surrounded by family, yet the ghosts of his victims followed in silence. For Uganda, his departure did not end the wounds. The soil remained stained, the memories sharp as broken glass. 1,000,000 lives had been touched by his terror, and no laughter, no parade, no crown could ever wash that away. And so the tale of Idi Amin lingers in the world like a nightmare half remembered. Was he a madman, consumed by delusion, or merely the perfect reflection of violence, learned and unrestrained? Was he clown or conqueror, fool or fiend? The answer dissolves like mist, leaving only the echo of silence. Even now, in the stillness of midnight, when the crickets sing and the moonlight spills across the Nile, there are whispers of the days when Uganda lived under his gaze. A gaze that smiled, that joked, that promised and then devoured. He was the butcher of Uganda, the man who laughed as his people wept, the ruler whose reign was written not in ink but in blood. And though he is gone, the land remembers. The soil breathes his name like a curse, and the silence remains beneath. The heavy silence of midnight jungles. The air carries a whisper faint yet eternal. It is not the cry of the jaguar, nor the rustle of serpents among the roots, but a name that clings to the damp stones and the forgotten pyramids, a name that lingers in the dark marrow of Mexico Hernan courts. To hear it is to stir. Ghosts, for with his arrival a world trembled, temples bled, and the ancient rhythm of drums fell quiet. The jungle remembers, even when men choose to forget. Once, in that age when Spain was drunk with gold and conquest, courts set sail across the unknown seas, chasing the shimmer of empire. His heart beat with a hunger that no prayer could soften. He carried the cross and the sword, yet it was the gleam of treasure that kindled his vision. When his ships scraped the shores of Mexico in 1519, it was as though fate itself had arrived, cloaked in steel and fire. Behind him lay the ocean's endless abyss. Before him, a land sacred, blood-rich, alive with gods older than Rome. The Aztec Empire stood proud, its capital, Tenochtitlan, rising from the waters like a vision. Causeways stretched like arms across the lake, and temples reached toward the sun. To the Spaniards, who had walked the cobbled streets of Seville and Salamanca, the city appeared unreal, as if conjured by sorcery. Gardens floated upon the waters, markets swelled with colors and scents, and at its heart pyramids of stone crowned with smoke. It was a city that rivaled any in the world, and soon it would burn courts advanced with cunning as sharp as the blade at his hip. He knew the empire was not whole, but fractured, its tributary states weary of the Aztec yoke. With whispers, with promises, with the sly art of alliance, he wove together a fragile net of allies. Chief among them was Melanson, known to the Spaniards as Dona Marina, a woman given to courts who became his voice, his eyes, his bridge between worlds. She spoke in tongues that wove destinies, translating not only words but power through. Her courts conquered more swiftly than with swords, yet even as he strode inland, shadows gathered. The Aztecs saw omens in the sky, a comet streaking fire, the mirror of water trembling, voices in the night. Their emperor Moctezuma was troubled by prophecy that a pale-skinned god might return from the east. Was Countess that god, or was he a herald of ruin? Uncertainty paralyzed him. To his people he was Huey Tlatoani, the great speaker, yet now his words faltered, and hesitation curdled the empire's strength. When Countess entered Tenochtitlan, he walked not as a conqueror, but as a guest. The streets bowed beneath him, lined with flowers, with offerings. Moctezuma himself greeted him, draped in gold and feathers, a monarch who seemed to shine. For days they walked side by side through the temples, the palaces, the markets where cacao beans and jade glistened. Yet beneath the courtesy still waited. Courtsmen gazed with fevered eyes at the gold that adorned every altar, every chamber. The scent of smoke and blood from the altars clung to them. They were wolves among temples, restless, waiting to strike, and strike they did. Moctezuma, once emperor, soon found himself a prisoner in his own palace, guarded by men who laughed in a language he could not command. The Aztec gods looked down from their temples, their altars still wet with sacrifice, yet powerless to break his chains. The city seethed, the people murmured, but Countess held the king as a shield, his voice forced to calm the storm. In this silence before the fire, both empires held their breath, but fate, restless and cruel, demanded blood. The Spaniards, fearing revolt, turned their swords upon the unarmed during a festival. The sacred square of Templo Mayor filled with music and dance, then with screams and blood. Warriors, women, priests all, were cut down beneath the steel of strangers. The streets erupted in fury, stone and fire answering blade and gun. Countess and his men, besieged within the city, tasted the sharp edge of Aztec rage. Then came La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Rain fell heavy as the Spaniards fled the city across the causeways, their arms weighed down by stolen gold. The lakes swallowed them, arrows rained from the darkness, and the waters turned red. Countess wept beneath a tree, his dream of conquest collapsing into mud and blood. Yet tears did not quench his hunger. He returned. With new allies, with ships built upon the lake's edge, with the steady cruelty of time, he encircled Tenochtitlan. The city starved, its canals clogged with corpses, its temples choked with smoke. Disease swept like a shadow, smallpox carried by the strangers, devouring those untouched by steel. The drums grew weaker, the cries dimmer, until at last the great city fell. Its temples toppled, its gods silenced. Stones that once bore the weight of empire became rubble beneath. Spanish boots. What rose upon those ruins was not merely Mexico City, but a new world carved upon bones. Churches grew where pyramids once stood. The cross replaced the eagle and serpent. The rhythm of the Aztec drum gave way to the toll of Spanish bells. Countess stood at the heart of it, a man who had dreamed himself into destiny. To his king he sent treasure beyond measure, yet with it came letters that spoke not of gold alone, but of glory, of the eternal shadow of empire. To his followers he was the hand of God upon heathen lands. To the vanquished he was no more than a butcher cloaked in piety, a serpent in armor. The jungle keeps its secrets, but it does not forgive. Beneath the streets of Mexico City, the bones of warriors and children rest, whispering through the earth. The temples that once reached the sky are ground into the foundations of new stone. The gods of rain and sun and war have fallen silent, their names carved away by time, yet in the night wind, one hears them still. Hernan Cortes walked into legend not as a saint, nor even as a hero, but as a storm. He was the hand that toppled an empire, the fire that devoured temples, the silence that swallowed gods. Whether destiny led him or ambition alone, none can say. But the ruins remember, the waters of the lake remember, and the jungle, in its endless whisper, still murmurs his name. In the heart of the night, when silence seems heavier than stone, there lingers a name whispered with dread, a name that drifts like smoke through the corridors of memory. Joseph. Mengele, to utter it is to summon shadows, to conjure the image of a man whose polished boots clicked upon the gravel paths of Auschwitz, where ash fell like snow and the horizon itself seemed to shudder under the weight of despair. They called him the angel of death, and his presence was a verdict. A smile could mean labor, a flick of the wrist could mean the gas chamber. He moved with a strange grace, almost courtly, as if death itself had found in him a gentleman to wear its mask. The camp was a kingdom of smoke and fences, of screams muffled by wind, of chimneys that belched grey columns into a sky too tired to protest. In this place where hope withered like grass in winter, Mengele walked as though he were not surrounded by ruin, but by some grand experiment of his own making. The train doors would slide open, and the weary would stumble forth, mothers clutching children, old men bent under invisible burdens, the young trembling with questions they dared not voice. And there he stood, immaculate in uniform, his hair parted neatly, his smile delicate, his eyes cool as winter steel. A simple gesture decided their fate, left for death, right for work. For some, a heartbeat of his judgment was the last they would ever know of this earth. But it was not merely the division of life and death that cast his shadow so far. Mengele's hunger was not for power alone, but for knowledge twisted into cruelty. He was drawn to twins, as a collector is drawn to rare artifacts. They fascinated him, two souls bound in mirrored flesh, two lives growing side by side like reflections upon water. To him, they were not children. They were specimens, living keys to secrets he believed the body held. The twins of Auschwitz were led away not to safety, but to rooms where scalpels gleamed, where syringes waited like fangs, and where science abandoned its soul. Within those walls, a silence reigned that was not of peace, but of terror. Little boys and girls sat together, holding hands as though their small fingers could weave a shield against what was coming. Needles pierced their veins. Dyes and chemicals coursed through their blood. One twin might be infected with disease, while the other was forced to endure the knife. Organs measured and weighed, their bodies reduced to pages in a grotesque ledger. The cries of children rose and fell, swallowed by the stone walls, while Mengele took notes with the detachment of a scholar recording stars. He spoke gently to them sometimes, offering sweets, stroking hair gestures that only deepened the abyss. For kindness wrapped in cruelty is a venom that lingers forever. There are stories whispered by survivors, their voices trembling even decades later. A girl recalling the smell of disinfectant and iron, the way her sister's hand went limp in hers as needles found their mark. A boy remembering the gleam of polished shoes as the doctor approached, smiling as though this were no horror, but some polite visit. They remembered the whistle of trains, the crunch of boots, the sudden flare of light in a world of darkness. And in those memories, Mengele remained not merely a man, but a spectral embodiment of how knowledge can be hollow when it is carved free from mercy. As the Reich crumbled, as Berlin burned and the iron eagles of the Nazis fell into ash, Mengele slipped away. Justice sought him, but shadows shielded him. He vanished like mist before dawn, and the world whispered his name in rage and disbelief. He crossed borders under false names, finding sanctuary among sympathizers, hiding in the labyrinths of South America where palms swayed and rivers coiled like serpents, while survivors rebuilt lives from shards of memory, while the ghosts of Auschwitz cried out for reckoning. The angel of death walked free, his face aging, his body wearing thin, yet his name never escaping the curse it carried. There were rumors of his life in exile, fragmented tales carried across continents. In Argentina, he lived comfortably, dining with friends, slipping into society's folds as though he were an ordinary man. In Paraguay, he became a shadow again, moving carefully, aware that hunters followed him. And in Brazil, his last refuge, he aged in secrecy, haunted by whispers of pursuit, yet never standing trial. To some, it seemed as though fate itself conspired to shield him, as though the earth had swallowed him to prevent his name from echoing in courtrooms where survivors longed to see him judged. And so he died, not by bullet, not by rope, but by the quiet hand of the sea. One day in 1979, he waded into the waters of São Paulo, and the waves closed over him as he drowned. There was no tribunal, no testimony, no verdict, only the indifferent silence of the ocean taking him, as though the elements themselves had grown weary of his running. When his bones were uncovered years later, the revelation was bitter. The angel of death had lived in shadows for decades, evading the justice that history had prepared for him. Yet death could not erase him. His name lingers in the cracks of memory, whispered in classrooms, recounted in survivor testimonies, recited as a warning in hushed midnight tones. He remains a figure of dread, not because of power or armies, but because of what he revealed, that science unmoored from conscience becomes a blade sharper than any forged in iron. His smile, his gloves, his note-saw are reminders that cruelty can wear the mask of civility, that death can arrive not in the roar of cannons, but in the quiet of a laboratory tonight. If you listen to the silence long enough, you might hear it. The echoes of children's voices, the rustle of the camp's bitter wind, the distant whistle of trains arriving at dawn. And in that haunted chorus, you may sense the presence of a man who thought himself master of life and death. His bones rest nameless beneath the soil of Brazil, but his ghost drifts still through the fog of history, carrying a warning carved in ash and blood. For the angel of death is more than a man remembered. He is a reminder that even in the heart of civilization, even amid progress and learning, darkness waits for the moment when morality falters, when compassion is silenced. And should it rise again, it will not come with fire and armies alone, may come with a smile, a scalpel, and the cold precision of hands that have forgotten the weight of mercy. The wind begins before the man. It is a whisper in the grass, a breath across the endless steppes, carrying the taste of iron and the smell of smoke. Out of that boundless silence, from a land that seemed barren and eternal, rose a figure who would shape the fate of half the world. His name was Temujin, though time would rename him with a word that struck fear into empire's Genghis Khan, the oceanic king, the endless conqueror. The steppe was both cradle and crucible. Its mornings broke with frost that clung to horse manes. Like silver thread, its nights stretched out under vaults of stars, so vast they crushed the heart. Here survival was a test written in hunger and steel. As a boy, Temujin knew hunger's gnaw, betrayal's sting, and the sharp taste of loss. His father was poisoned, his family cast into exile, his youth a landscape of cold and starvation. Yet from those wounds he forged a spirit tempered harder than the iron of his arrows. They say he could ride from horizon to horizon without tiring, as though the earth itself had bred him for the saddle. His people, the Mongols, were wanderers, bound not by stone walls but by wind and sky, and under his command they became a storm. To those who faced them, the sound of hooves was a death knell. To his warriors, it was the heartbeat of destiny. The kingdoms of the world saw him first as a raider, then as a scourge, and at last as inevitability itself. The Jin dynasty of China, proud and ancient, watched in horror as his cavalry slipped, like shadows across their borders. Cities that had stood for centuries fell in days. Samarkand, Buhara Nishapur, names heavy with centuries of prayer and poetry, were ground into dust beneath his banners. His armies did not march. They flowed. They consumed. They erased. Yet to see only ruin in his shadow is to miss the strange paradox of his reign. He demanded loyalty with a hand of iron, but he repaid it with protection. He shattered clans and empires, but in the fragments he bound together a new order. His law, the Yasa, was as unforgiving as the steppe itself, but it gave justice where once there had been only vengeance. Along the Silk Road, caravans that had once feared the bandit and the taxman found new safety under his dominion. A merchant could travel from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian and know that his goods and his life were under the unseen watch of the Khan's will. Still, terror was his shadow. Legends tell of mountains of skulls piled outside city gates, of rivers running red with the blood of those who defied him. To resist him was to invite annihilation. His warriors carried fire in their saddlebags, and the scream of their arrows was a hymn to fear. Mothers hushed their children with his name, as if he were more spectre than man. And yet his empire breathed with strange contradictions. Tolerance for faiths, respect for skill, and a vision of unity forged through domination. Whispers spread of his birth being marked by omens, of a clot of blood in his tiny fist, as though destiny itself had chosen him for conquest. Others claimed he spoke to the sky, that Tengritha, eternal blue, heaven favored him with visions. To his followers, he was not merely a man, but the axis on which the world turned. To his enemies, He was a scourge, sent by God to humble the arrogant. His death came as suddenly as his rise. No fortress could hold him, no empire outlast him, but his body, like all flesh, betrayed him. Some say he fell from his horse, others that a wound festered, still others that he was struck in battle. The truth is lost, hidden, like so much of his life, behind veils of silence. What remains is the story of his burial, as mysterious as his power, they say. A procession carried him across the steppes, and every witness to the funeral was killed to preserve the secret. Horses trampled the earth flat, erasing the soil where he was laid. Rivers were diverted to wash away his grave, as if the world itself bent to conceal him. No tombstone marks his rest, no shrine bears his name. The greatest conqueror in history vanished into the silence of the steppe, leaving only wind and grass to guard him, and so he remains everywhere and nowhere. His empire, though fractured, changed the world forever. From Europe to China, the ripple of his reign can still be felt. He was barbarian and visionary, destroyer and lawgiver, a blade that cut through the fabric of history. In him, terror and order were twins, bound together by the will of one man. Listen, then, to the silence he left behind. Imagine the steppe. At dusk, when the sun bleeds red into the horizon and the air smells of smoke and cold iron, somewhere beneath that vastness, beneath earth and grass and centuries of forgetting, lies the body of Genghis Khan. But his true grave is written in the bones of cities, in the lines of maps, in the mingling of cultures that once trembled at his name. The wind still whispers across the steppes. It carries no answers, only questions. Was he monster or maker, visionary or executioner? The earth does not tell, the sky does not speak. Only the silence of the endless grass remembers. And in that silence, the rider without end gallops still. The lamps of Europe burn softly in polished halls, while, far away, another fire consumed a continent. In the hush of velvet parlours and gilded chambers, Leopold II of Belgium spoke in measured tones, his voice refined, his manner dignified. Few could have guessed that behind his tall frame and icy gaze lay a hunger not for kingship, but for possession and empire carved in secrecy, owned not by his nation, but by himself. He was not a monarch of fields and palaces alone, but a king of shadows, stretching his hand over the Congo like a vast eclipse. The year was 1885, and the Berlin Conference had carved Africa into pieces of parchment and ink, its rivers and forests reduced to lines on European maps. Leopold, with charm and cunning, disguised his designs beneath words of philanthropy. He promised the great powers that he would bring civilization, charity, and light to the Congo basin. He spoke of ending the slave trade, of building schools and missions, of roads that would connect villages to the sea. He named his dominion the Congo Free State, as though liberty could be conjured by decree. Yet in truth it was neither free nor a state. It was his private kingdom, his crown of thorns. Into the dense forests, where mists clung like spirits to the trees, his agents came, men armed not with holy books, but with rifles and ledgers. They did not seek souls to save, but rubber to harvest, ivory to ship, wealth to bleed from the earth itself. The Congo became a vast plantation of suffering. Villagers were bound in quotas, every man forced to collect sap from the vines, every woman made hostage until the task was done. Failure was met with the whip, or worse with the blade. For every bullet expended, a severed hand was demanded, proof that no shot was wasted. And so the rivers ran with silence, broken only by the cries of children, and the echo of machetes cutting through flesh and vine alike. It was said that the forest itself began to mourn. The drums that once beat in celebration grew faint, replaced by the hollow wail of grief. Fires no longer marked festivals, but smouldered ruins, villagers punished for disobedience. Mothers cradled children with stumps where tiny fingers should have been, while fathers carried the unbearable weight of shame and rage. To the world beyond, ivory tusks gleamed like trophies, and rubber, supple and black, fueled the machines of Europe's progress. In polished salons, no one spoke of the price paid in Congo's silence, but truth, like water, refuses to stay buried. Whispers began to escape, carried by missionaries who could not quiet their conscience, by travelers who saw too much, by photographs that revealed the unspeakable. A child staring at the stump of his severed arm, a man seated beside the tiny hand and foot of his daughter. These were not tales of legend, but fragments of reality, each one an indictment etched in flesh. Leopold, however, remained untouched. He reigned from his palace in Brussels with cold detachment, speaking of civilization while counting his profits. He built monuments, grand halls, gardens trimmed with precision. He declared himself a modern Caesar, a man of vision. Yet the stones he laid in Belgium were cemented with Congo's bones. He did not need to raise his voice or lift his hand. His agents carried out his will with efficiency, a machine of cruelty disguised as progress. The toll is said to have reached 10 million. Lives an ocean of souls swallowed in silence. Some died of hunger, unable to meet impossible quotas. Others fell to disease as villages collapsed. Countless more were executed for rebellion or resistance. The Congo's forests, once alive with laughter and song, became a necropolis beneath the canopy of green. Every vine of rubber seemed watered with blood, every ivory tusk carved from a grave. And yet, history has its ghosts who do not sleep. From the Congo itself rose voices of defiance, chiefs who resisted with spear and shield, women who sang forbidden songs of remembrance, children who whispered names so they would not be lost. In Europe, too, a storm gathered. Writers, journalists, and missionaries began to cry out. E.D. Morel, a shipping clerk, noticed the ships leaving Belgium heavy with rubber and ivory, yet returning to Africa with only guns and chains. He saw the pattern and gave it words. Alongside him, Roger Casement, the Irish consul, bore witness with a heart that could not remain silent. Together they pulled at the veil of lies. The Congo Reform Association was born, and for the first time, the world began to glimpse the abyss behind Leopold's mask. Newspapers carried accounts of mutilations, of villages burned, of families torn apart. Photographs reached parlors and drawing rooms, and Europe's comfortable silence began to crack. Still, Leopold denied, maneuvered, and schemed. He called his critics liars, enemies of progress. He insisted that all was done in the name of civilization. But truth clung to him like a shroud he could not shake off. When at last, in 1908, the Belgian state was forced to seize control of the Congo from him, it was not out of mercy for its people, but to quell the scandal that threatened to engulf Europe. The Free State was dissolved, its ownership transferred from one master to another. Yet for the Congolese, freedom did not come. The shadow of exploitation lingered, softer in tone but still heavy in presence. Leopold himself retreated into his wealth, unrepentant, living out his final years amidst luxury, cloaked in denial. When he died, church bells rang, but in the streets of Brussels, the people turned their backs, booing as his funeral procession passed. Even in death, he was haunted. The statues of Leopold remain in Belgium, bronze effigies staring into the distance, yet they are uneasy monuments, their silence filled with accusation. For some, they are relics of national pride. For others, wounds carved into stone. Protesters daub them with paint, drape them in chains, or call for their removal. Still they stand, embodiments of a truth Europe has long struggled to face, that beneath the marble of civilization lies the granite of cruelty, and that the wealth of nations may rest upon the bones of the voiceless. The Congo itself remembers. Its forests still breathe, its rivers still flow, yet the memory of Leopold lingers like a scar upon the land. Generations whisper stories of the red rubber, of the hands severed, of the silence that fell over villages. These are not merely tales of the past, but shadows stretching into the present, shaping the way history is told, and how nations reckon with their own reflection in the end. Leopold II remains a figure both distant and near, a king who cloaked himself in progress while drowning millions in darkness. Was he blinded by greed, or was he the very embodiment of imperial cruelty? The answer may be both, for greed without conscience becomes its own form of blindness, and cruelty, when crowned, becomes indistinguishable from power. In the hush of night, when the world grows still, one might imagine the spirits of the Congo rising from the mist, their voices carried by the rustle of leaves, their silence louder than drums. They do not speak his name with reverence, but with sorrow. And in that sorrow there lies a truth, too vast to be buried, a truth that reminds us that the wealth of one man's shadow may condemn generations to darkness. And so, Leopold's statues stand, bronze and unyielding, yet haunted, for stone can hold shape, but not absolution. And memory, once awakened, does not rest. Beneath the weight of heaven's silence, where the mountains meet the drifting mists of the Yellow River, there is a story that lingers like the echo of a drumbeat in a cavern. It is the story of a man who once sought to bind eternity itself in chains of stone and clay. He was called Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. To his subjects he was both god and demon, the unifier of fractured lands, the builder of wonders, and the wielder of terrors so vast that his name would echo through centuries. Yet behind his iron mask of power, throbbed a fear as fragile and human as any fear of the dark. Fear of silence, fear of being swallowed by the namelessness of death. Imagine the world in which he arose, the Warring States era, a time when rivers ran red and kingdoms devoured one another in endless cycles of betrayal. China was a puzzle shattered into jagged shards, each piece clawing at its neighbor. Then came Ying Zhang, son of Qin, a boy thrust into the throne before he could wield a sword. By cunning, cruelty, and brilliance, he transformed himself into Qin Shi Huangdong's emperor. He burned away the disorder of ages with fire and blade, until nothing remained but his will. Stretching from the eastern seas to the western deserts, the land trembled under his command. Roads like veins of stone cut across mountains and valleys, binding his empire into one body. A wall rose from the earth like the spine of a giant, holding back the shadows of the north. Armies marched in ranks of iron, their footsteps like thunder rolling endlessly across the plains. It was said that heaven itself bowed to him, that the dragons of the sky turned their heads when his chariots passed. Yet, for all his triumphs, he trusted no man, no priest, no scholar. He trusted only silence, obedience, and the weight of fear. He ordered the burning of books, the wisdom of ages reduced to ash. Words themselves became a crime when they dared to remember a past without him. Scholars who whispered against his decrees were buried alive, their cries muffled by the soil, their knowledge interred with them. For Qin Shi Huang believed that memory was power, and to erase all memory but his own was to carve himself into eternity. He wanted a world where time itself would bow before his reign, where the future would carry only his name like an endless echo. But power has its shadows. At night, when the wind stirred through the imperial palaces and the torches flickered against painted walls, he was not the unshakable titan his people feared. He was a man haunted by death. The thought of the grave gnawed at him like rats in the dark. He sought counsel not only from ministers of war, but from magicians, alchemists, and seekers of forbidden arts. They promised him what he most desired, immortality. They spoke of islands far across the eastern seas, where immortals drank from springs untouched by decay. They placed in his hands strange elixirs brewed from jade powder, herbs, and mercury, the shining liquid metal that seemed to flow like captured moonlight. He drank, desperate to silence the ticking of mortality. Each bitter draught was meant to carry him beyond the grasp of time. Instead, the mercury coursed through his veins like poison. His body grew restless, his mind erratic. He paced like a caged beast, driven by dreams of eternity that always slipped just beyond his reach. His quest for life eternal became a race with death, and death was gaining. As his strength waned, he turned his gaze to the earth itself. If heaven denied him eternity, then he would build it with his own hands. Deep beneath the ground, artisans and laborers toiled for decades to shape a tomb unlike any before or since. It was said to mirror his empire, a subterranean kingdom where rivers flowed not with water but with mercury, their shimmering currents winding through a landscape of palaces and towers. Over them arched a ceiling painted with the constellations of the night sky, so that even in death the heavens would bend to his will. Guarding him in silence were thousands of warriors, not of flesh but of clay, the terracotta army, each soldier carved with a face unique as if once alive, each stance frozen in vigilance. Generals, archers, charioteers, and even horses stood waiting, their spears and bows pointed toward eternity. They were not statues, but shadows, a legion of silence to serve their emperor in the world beyond. To this day, when their eyes are unearthed from the soil, they seem to hold a spark of life, as though the souls of soldiers long dead had been pressed into clay dot, and so he lay waiting, sealed within the earth. The chronicles tell us that when he finally died on a journey far from his capital, his attendants, terrified of rebellion, concealed his passing. They filled his carriage with salted fish to disguise the stench of his decaying body. Even in death he was hidden, masked in secrecy, his final journey cloaked in deception. Yet though his body was returned to his vast mausoleum, the man himself was never truly at peace, for the tomb remains unopened, a wound in the earth too dangerous to disturb. Ancient texts whisper that the rivers of mercury still flow there, a poisoned sea that glimmers in the dark. Modern instruments have detected strange traces of metal beneath the soil, lending weight to the legend. But no hand dares to pry open the emperor's eternal chamber. Perhaps the earth itself conspires to keep him sealed, for to disturb him might be to release not only mercury's poison, but the restless spirit of the tyrant himself. And so Qin Shi Huang endures in a strange twilight of history. His dream of immortality failed, yet he is remembered more vividly than most mortals could ever dream. His terracotta army stands in endless ranks, their silence louder than any shout of war. His roads still run across the mountains, his wall still climbs the ridges of stone, his name still chills the air of storytellers. Yet his true empire was not the land, nor the armies, nor the monuments. It was fear, fear that outlives him still. Fear that bound millions in silence. Fear that even now clings to the darkened air around his unopened tomb. Perhaps that is his final paradox. He sought to escape death, yet death claimed him swiftly. He longed to erase memory, yet his cruelty is remembered. He hoped to be a god, yet he remains a man broken by mercury, sealed in clay. Trembling before the silence he tried to command. And still the earth waits, holding his secret chamber in its quiet embrace. A warning and a mystery. In the end, Qin Shi Huang is not only the story of an emperor, but of humanity itself, or a terror of endings. Our hunger to leave footprints upon the sand of time, our desperate struggle against the silence of the grave. His wall crumbles, his armies have turned to dust, but the story remains. And in that story he has found the immortality his poisons could not grant him. The night air hangs heavy over the plains of Shanxi, where beneath the soil the tyrant lies. The stars glimmer faintly, as though painted by the same artisans who shaped his tomb, and the wind carries a question older than any empire. Is it better to be remembered as a tyrant than to be forgotten as a man? Night folds its wings over Renaissance, Italy, and the land lies restless beneath a velvet sky. The wind brushes through the olive groves like a whisper of confessions never spoken, and the stones of old fortresses seem to breathe with memories of ambition, lust, and betrayal. It is here, in this charged silence between faith and sin, that the name Cesare Borgia emerges like a dark star, burning, ruthless, and unforgettable. His tale is one told not in the gentle cadence of virtue, but in the metallic ring of steel, in the bitter taste of poison, and in the shadowed alleys where prayers died unheard. Cesare was born into a family that did not believe in destiny, they manufactured it. His father, Rodrigo Borgia, climbed the rungs of the church until he crowned himself Pope Alexander VI. Power flowed in their bloodline like an inheritance of fire. The Vatican halls, painted with saints and martyrs, echoed with whispers of scandal and ambition, and in the midst of that echo, Cesare was sculpted. Unlike the quiet devotion expected of a cardinal, he burned with a different hunger, not for God's kingdom, but for Italy's throne. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the grace of a predator. His eyes were sharp, assessing, like a man perpetually weighing lives on invisible scales. People who met him felt both drawn and endangered, as if standing too close to a flame. Charisma was his shield, cruelty his sword, and together they made him irresistible to allies and terrifying to enemies. He was the embodiment of what the Renaissance feared and adored, a man who worshipped power as though it were the only deity worth kneeling to. Italy, in those years, was a fractured mirror. City-states gleamed with art, commerce, and philosophy, yet behind their gilded facades lay treachery and endless war. Florence schemed with Venice, Milan plotted against Naples, and Rome stood as a throne of corruption in the center of it all. Csejte entered this theater like a dark actor destined to rewrite the play. He shed his cardinal's robes with the same ease one discards an old disguise, and took up the sword. His father's blessing gave him license, and his will gave him wings. It was said that no obstacle could withstand him. Rivals fell mysteriously, as though fate itself conspired to clear his path. A banquet would end in sudden illness. A political foe would vanish, his body never found, his silence more damning than his words. Caesar's hand was rarely seen, but its shadow stretched across Italy. Men feared to drink wine in his company, for the glass might conceal death. Women feared the intensity of his gaze, which promised passion and ruin alike. Yet he did not kill for sport. His violence was an instrument, like a lute played with cruel precision. Every note measured to construct the song of his dominion. Machiavelli, the sharp-eyed diplomat of Florence, watched him closely. He recorded his campaigns, his decisions, his betrayals, with a fascination bordering on reverence. For here was the living embodiment of power stripped of morality, a prince who made cruelty seem like wisdom, and treachery seem like strategy. If fortune had not betrayed him, Machiavelli later mused, Cesare would have been invincible. To Machiavelli, he was the model of a ruler, perfect in all but his final defeat. And so Cesare became immortal not by the sanctity of saints or the songs of poets, but by the pen of a philosopher who found in him the essence of power itself. Caesar's campaigns burned across the Romagna like a storm. Cities bent their knees to him, not out of love, but out of terror. He would ride into conquered towns with banners unfurled, his soldiers armored in steel and silence, his face lit by a calm that unnerved more than rage ever could. Those who resisted were made examples. Corpses hung in public squares, throats slit in the night, poison poured into chalices during feasts. Yet when dawn came, the streets were orderly, the markets alive, the peasants secure under his iron rule. Fear, it seemed, was a stronger foundation than loyalty, and Csejte built upon it with relentless skill. But ruthlessness has its price. The same hands that shaped his ascent wove threads of his undoing. His father, Pope Alexander, the great spider, at the center of the Borgia web, died suddenly, some say, from the very poison they themselves had brewed for others. With the Pope's death, Caesar's protection dissolved like mist at sunrise. Enemies rose from the shadows, emboldened now that the giant's shield had fallen. The French, once his allies, turned cold. Rome withdrew its blessing. Rivals sharpened their daggers in secret. Csejte did not fall quietly. Even as his power crumbled, he moved like a man refusing to bow to fate. He sought alliances, gathered soldiers, and rode into battle with the same fearless hunger that had carved his earlier triumphs. But fortune, that fickle mistress he had once mastered, turned her face from him. His body weakened from illness, his soldiers deserted. At Viana, on foreign soil in Navarre, he rode into combat against overwhelming odds. The dawn was misted with blood and steel, and in the chaos of the charge, Caesar's legend met its abrupt silence. Surrounded, struck down, his body was left in the mud, stripped of armor, his name whispered like a curse and a warning. Thus ended the prince of ruthlessness, not by dagger in shadow, not by poison's quiet sting, but by the crude unleveling hand of battle. His dream of carving Italy into a kingdom under his dominion vanished like smoke, leaving behind only the myth. And myths, unlike kingdoms, never die. Even now, when the corridors of power are spoken of, when leaders are judged, not by mercy but by effectiveness, his name arises. Cesare Borgia, the man who made cruelty efficient, who turned betrayal into an art, who lived not as a servant of conscience, but as its executioner. To remember him is to gaze into the darker mirror of ambition, to see not what man should be, but what man may become when stripped of all but desire. The night grows heavy, and the candle burns low. The silence of ruined fortresses in Rumonia lingers like a hymn to his ghost. Some say his spirit rides still across the misty hills, armored and relentless, seeking the empire that slipped from his grasp. Others say his story is a warning etched in blood and shadow, a reminder that power built on fear is no fortress against time. And so Caesar's tale rests not in peace, but in unease, half finished, like a shadow severed by dawn. His footsteps echo in history's corridors, where ambition walks hand in hand with ruin, and the whisper of his name still stirs the midnight air. Cesare, 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 the prince of ruthlessness, the son of power, the man who lived like a storm and died like a soldier forgotten by the morning. The lamps of Edo burned low, their glow like scattered fireflies trembling against the vast silence of the night. The city lay under the weight of its own stillness, its wooden houses pressed shoulder to shoulder, their paper screens thin as whispers. Somewhere beyond the hush of sleeping courtyards, a temple bell tolled, each note sinking into the marrow of the people, carrying with it an unspoken fear. For in the reign of Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, no life was safe, neither man nor beast, but strangely, it was the dogs of Edo that slept in greater comfort than its people. Tsunayoshi's story begins in shadows, as if the very stars had cast an omen upon his birth. He was born in the year of the dog, under the auspices of the Chinese zodiac, when priests muttered warnings of karmic debts that trailed behind his soul like unseen smoke. It was said that his mother clutched talismans, fearing her son's spirit was cursed, and so from the cradle he was pressed into the arms of rituals, sutras, and whispered Buddhist prayers. As he grew, so too did his obsession with the fragile balance between sin and salvation, between punishment in this life and release in the next. The shogunate he inherited was not weak. Edo thrived with merchants, farmers, artisans, and courtiers, moving like currents in a great tide. Rice flowed, gold gleamed, and the Tokugawa name stood unshaken. Yet within the heart of this order, the new shogun's mind carried the fever of conviction. He came to believe that the killing of animals, especially dogs, was a wound upon the universal order, a stain upon his own karmic path. What began as murmurs from priests and astrologers hardened into laws etched into the bone of society. The first edicts came quietly. No man was to abandon a dog. No man was to harm a dog. Those who disobeyed would suffer grave punishment. But as seasons turned, Tsunayoshi's commands grew sharper, stranger, unrelenting. Soon it was not merely forbidden to strike an animal, but even the neglect of one could summon the noose or the executioner's blade. A farmer who cast a stone at a stray could be torn from his family. A mother who failed to feed a wandering hound might find her house confiscated, her body broken beneath the weight of the law. The air of Edo grew heavy with dread, for the cries of animals now carried more weight than the pleas of men. The shogun ordered the construction of great kennels, sprawling like towns unto themselves. Tens of thousands of dogs were gathered, plucked from streets, fields, and villages, herded together behind walls where food and care were lavished upon them as though they were noble retainers. Palaces of bark and straw were raised for their comfort, and servants fed them rice while the poor gnawed on scraps of millet. The citizens of Edo whispered bitterly into their sleeves. The dog shogun had given beasts palaces while men slept. In ruin at night, the kennels howled. Their cries rolled over Edo like a storm at sea, echoing through alleys and temples. Children woke trembling, mothers pressed fingers to their lips, and men sat in silence, their eyes dark with hunger. To live under Tsunayoshi was to breathe fear into every act, for no one knew when the law's shadow might fall. The punishment was swift, the crime often slight, and the reasoning cloaked in the shogun's strange devotion to mercy distorted into tyranny. Yet some said there was no madness in him. They claimed he was earnest, that his eyes gleamed with a desperate need to cleanse the sins of the people, to balance the scales of heaven and earth. In Buddhist doctrine, to protect life, matter how small, was to gain merit beyond measure. Perhaps Tsunayoshi, haunted by the fortune of his birth, believed that his salvation could only be bought with the sheltering of countless creatures. The dogs became his prayer, their survival his offering to eternity. But compassion twisted into cruelty. For every dog that thrived, a family starved. For every kennel filled with warmth, a farmer's hut stood empty. The weight of the shogun's obsession pressed upon the land like frost upon fragile crops. Merchants grew weary of trade, peasants feared their own tongues, and silence thickened across the city, broken only by the endless barking of pampered strays. Legends tell of a day when an old woman, her ribs sharp as bamboo, collapsed upon the road. At her side stood a dog, tail wagging, eyes gleaming. The officials who passed gave rice to the dog, but none to the woman. She died in silence, while the animal licked the last of her tears. Whether this tale is truth or merely the bitter invention of Edo's weary hearts, it travelled across the city like a ghost story, deepening the wound of Tsunayoshi's reign. The shogun himself seemed distant, cloistered in his palaces, surrounded by scriptures and priests. It is said he would sit for hours before gilded statues of the Buddha, reciting sutras while outside his people languished. He may have believed himself merciful, but the city he ruled had become a theatre of quiet suffering. Behind every act of protection for the dogs was the shadow of violence against his subjects. In time, he earned his eternal name, the dog shogun, an epithet spoken not with reverence, but with wariness, anger, and disbelief. And yet, what remains most haunting is not the cruelty itself, but the mystery of his intent. Was Tsunayoshi truly mad, his mind cracked beneath the weight of omens and superstition? Or was he consumed by a vision of compassion so absolute that it devoured the very people he was meant to guard? Did he imagine that heaven would welcome him, garlanded with the loyalty of thousands of dogs? Or was he simply lost in a labyrinth of fear and belief from which he could never return? His reign ended, as all reigns must, swallowed by the slow turning of time. The kennels emptied, the laws faded, and the people of Edo exhaled their first free breath in years. But the echoes of that strange rule lingered, whispered in tea-houses, remembered in tales told to children at night. Even now, his figure stands at the edge of history, cloaked in paradox, a ruler remembered not for battles won or castles built, but for a love so misdirected it curdled into terror. Tonight, when the city sleeps, imagine Edo under Tsunayoshi's watch. Imagine the fog rolling in from the Sumeda River, curling between the wooden houses like pale smoke. Imagine the hush of footsteps, cautious and quick, for none dare disturb the silence. And then listen. Hear the dogs, their howls rising above. The stillness, fed while the people starve, sheltered while the poor freeze. The empire itself becomes an echo of their cries, a vast chorus of hunger and devotion, madness and mercy entwined. In this strange chapter of history, compassion became cruelty, mercy turned to tyranny, and the karmic salvation of one man cost the suffering of many. Perhaps in the stillness of the night, as the last bell tolls and the lamps gutter into darkness, one can hear not only the dogs of Edo, but the souls of its people waiting, watching, wondering what it means to be ruled by a man who sought heaven in the eyes of beasts, while his own subjects languished in silence.